Thank you all for having me today. Some of you were at my presentation at last year's Principal Entrepreneurship Conference on the Missionary of Wall Street, and I think you therefore know me as someone maybe a little bit out of his mind out on the streets of New York selling Christ to other people. And one of the themes of that book was the importance of engagement. That we're in a culture here that's gradually slipping away from the Lord, and I think as Catholics we have a responsibility to get out into the culture and engage that culture and bring people back to Him. And today I want to talk about maybe the other side of the Missionary of Wall Street, which is the Wall Street side. And no surprise, some of the same features and some of the same values that have worked for me as a missionary have worked for me on Wall Street as well. And I want to talk about those, and specifically about investing within this world of woke capitalism. One broad comment I'd like to make is that I think as business leaders, as Catholics, a lot of us want to just run from this topic of woke capitalism. It seems like one that's very foreign to us, has a lot of things about it in terms of its value system that as Catholics we disagree with, and as Christians perhaps. I want to suggest instead engagement. Woke capitalism is, in my mind, a product of an ex-Christian culture almost, but one which has a Christian heritage. And many of the objectives of the woke capitalists, you could disagree with their means and their methodologies, but many of their objectives actually share a Christian heritage to them in terms of concern about the poor, concern about making the world a better place, taking care of the environment, etc. And as Catholics, I think we need to engage this movement and be involved with it, because this ultimately is our ground. We were the original woke capitalists, if you will, and we still are. And I want to talk more about that within the world of Wall Street, and start with some stories about some of the virtues of Catholicism and of Christianity that have worked well for me as a leader, and then a little bit more about specific investment opportunities that we've had at Federated Hermes, where I work as the Chief Investment Officer. I work, as I mentioned, at Federated Hermes. Many of you know the company was founded by a devout Catholic, great family man, Jack Donahue, who founded it on a lot of Catholic principles, particularly the dignity of every person, the importance of respect for work, the joy of work, and the importance of playing for the long haul. What we call sustainable long-term gains as opposed to short-term gains. And when you play for the long haul, you start worrying about a lot of things that the woke capitalists claim capitalists generally aren't worried about, which is not just how you line your own pocketbook, but what you're doing for your employees, what you're doing for your customers, what you're doing for the world at large. And in many ways, Federated was founded on very Catholic principles, though clearly it's not a so-called Catholic company. I mean, we, as an investment firm, need to be open to all faiths and all diversity of backgrounds. In fact, we thrive on diversity. But a lot of these principles apply. And I'm going to give you 5 of them that have worked particularly well for me in my role as a leader within Wall Street and at Federated. And the first one I'm going to talk about is one that you probably don't think really belongs in business at all, but it's basically prayer. And the reason I bring up prayer is that I think for all of us as Catholics, this is a very important part of our day, of our process, of the way we think about the world. It also really works well for me in a leadership context. I kind of try to start my day with prayer and have an objective for the day based on what the Lord's telling me through prayer. And importantly, throughout the day, if you took a look at my schedule, which my secretary keeps very close tabs of, you will see little 15-minute gaps here and there where she can fit them in, called JC time. And I use that as a chance to retune with the Lord and really review my day. How's it going? And little things, that I could have done better. Maybe been a little more respectful in one situation, a little more thoughtful in another. And, for me, I view prayer during the day as a way of letting the Lord coach me up and making me a better leader. He was, after all, the great servant leader. And so I think prayer actually belongs very much as a part of a business leader's everyday workflow. The second one I want to talk about, a great Christian virtue that works really well in the workplace, is dignity. And, we're hearing a lot about dignity now in the various movements around the country. But again, this is something that belongs, is rooted really in our faith over 2,000 years. And the concept of dignity is one, as you know, is one that's built on the understanding that we're all children of God. Every last one of us, the small, the big, the rich, the poor, and, the mail clerk and the CIO. And when you think about everyone in that context, you begin to love them as a brother or sister in Christ, whether they're Christian or Jewish or Muslim or atheist or whatever they are. We still love them as a child of God, and we treat them with the dignity that they are deserved as that child of God. And I must say, when you actually believe that, as opposed to you've learned it in an HR class on dignity training workshop. And I'm not knocking an HR class. We need things like that as well to inculcate that culture. But maybe a key difference between people of faith and some of the woke capitalist movement is that one way to get there is to try to legislate all this stuff and to set rules and regulations and tell everyone exactly how they're to behave. Another way is to convert their hearts through engagement and through understanding of how people are as children of God. And for me, conversion of heart is always a more permanent solution than something that's legislated. So I'd say dignity is an area where, as Catholics, as Christians, we really have a leg up on how to behave in the workplace and how to behave towards customers and suppliers. Another one is self-mastery, and this, of course, is a great Christian virtue. The idea here being that we need to use the graces of the Lord to help us control our passions and emotions. We're all driven with different needs and greeds and desires. And particularly, in the workplace, particularly in the investment markets of Wall Street, I got to tell you, self-mastery is one of the key areas of my faith that really helped me as an investor and as a business leader. The staff at Federated Hermes has many little Authisms they like to quote, and one of them is, why don't we all take a walk around the block? And usually I'll use that at a time when passions are running high, people want a quick decision, and sometimes I find it's just better, in my own case at least, to just take a step back and cool off and not make the quick decision, but make the right decision. Thinking back to March as an example, when the markets were coming apart and wheels were coming off the bus, I was under a lot of pressure to, let's how to get reconfigured here. We were frankly way too optimistic going into it. We didn't really expect the COVID thing, so we were probably mispositioned in some ways. And I remember, saying, okay, I got to stall for time here. This is no time to make a quick decision. And we focused everybody on developing a new framework to think about the world. And by the time we developed that, a couple of weeks, things had begun to turn. Things started to look a little bit better. So I think sometimes, this virtue of self-mastery is one that can really apply in the business context that is itself a very Christian virtue. The fourth one I want to talk about is humility. And this, of course, is one of the centers of our faith. It's a foundational virtue of the Christian faith. But my goodness, how important it is in the business world, and how many people blow themselves up as they start to believe their own line of whatever and their own success, and it was all about them, and invariably they overstep and do something really bad. And this leads to the Gordon Gekko image of Wall Street, if you will, or the Wolf of Wall Street, or the various other scandals that have been out there. So for me, humility is one of the key things I focus on in my own case. And another great Authism within the staff is one of my favorites is humility at the highs, confidence at the lows, integrity always. But the humility part is a really key element. And as the CIO, it's one of the things I most focus on with my folks is keeping them confident when things are bad, like March of 2020, but also humble when things are going really well, and trying to keep us all grounded to keep ourselves from overstepping. And of course, humility works really well when you're dealing with customers and you're not trying to run over them, but work with them. So I'd say humility is another big virtue that is really important. And the last one I want to talk about is love. And the reason I bring up love, again, this is like prayer, is one of these things like, what does love belong in the workplace? And I think my audience gets this already probably, but let me say it. This is love in the St. Paul sense, love in a very deeply Christian sense, agape love, self-sacrificing love. This is the love of the servant leader who's there not for his or her own sake, but for the sake of others, and views his leadership or her leadership as one of an opportunity to help others be great, be the greatest they could be, the person that God wanted them to be. And so love works really well for me in the workplace. I must say, in a very deep way, I love every person that works for me. I view myself as their servant. I want them to do well, and they sense that, I think, and they love me back. And that applies to our customers as well and the people we do business with. And I think when you bring that attitude of love to the workplace, it smooths out a lot of the rough edges that the woke capitalists see in capitalism that think can only be solved by some sort of grand restructuring of the economy or a big government, rules of order, if you will. A lot of that can be addressed simply by having a little more love in the workplace. It's not uncommon for me to sign emails, love Steve, and people get these all the time. It's like, they get it. It's not a romantic kind of love, of course. It's much more of a servant's love. But I think that a little more love in the world goes a long, long way. It conquered the world. It's helped me on the streets of New York, and it's helped me in the canyons of Wall Street to be successful. I want to turn now to three specific examples of investing in this world of woke capitalism, and a version of it perhaps that's called ESG, you may have heard of. But in the investment world, this is all the rage now: environmental, social, and governance investing. So the idea being that we need to invest with a broader sense of profitability, if you will, beyond just sheer profits, P&L statements, but the impact on everyone and everything around us. The way at Federated Hermes we think about this is not just signing up to some banal list of objectives that match somebody's idea of what's good and what's bad, but rather as investors worried about investing for the long haul. We're not traders, and our clients were investing, their pensions, their retirement, if you will. It's important for us to be earning for people a sustainable long-term return, sustainable investing. And if you think about ESG in that context, a lot of these principles actually fit pretty well within the context of making sure that an investment that we make is sustainable over time, isn't just pursuing a short-term profit at the expense of perhaps a long-term issue. So let me give you three specific examples of this. The first is BATS. BATS is a company you may know is in the tobacco business, British American Tobacco, one of the big tobacco producers around the world. And we have a portfolio devoted to earning dividends for our investor base, our client base, who are looking for a very conservative dividend-producing stream of assets. And tobacco companies often fit this bill because they're making, a pretty good, healthy cash flow stream. They can throw off a lot of cash and a lot of dividends. But as a Catholic, I can tell you that I struggle with these kinds of investments just because obviously what they're involved in doing is unhealthy at least, and in that sense, perhaps even immoral. So how do you navigate this space? And 3 or 4 years ago now, probably maybe more like 4 or 5 years ago, I went out to London with the head of my dividend team to meet with British American Tobacco with its lead management team. And my objective there was to get my hands around what they're actually doing. And one of the things that became a key topic of that meeting was taking a bigger role within the world of reduced risk tobacco products. You can get technical terms like heat not burn and electronic cigarettes, etc. But products that themselves are a much healthier alternative to traditional tobacco products, and particularly given that a lot of customers are more or less addicted to this product, offering them a healthier alternative to us seemed like a pretty good idea, both in terms of the moral high ground, if you will, but also because over time it would create a more sustainable stream of cash flows for our shareholders at the same time, because clearly there was going to be a higher and higher demand for this kind of product, more and more regulation, and the companies that could lead in that space would end up being the ones that did the best. So it was a kind of win-win. And a big takeaway from that meeting was understanding that British American Tobacco was actually on course, and we certainly encouraged it. And today we only have 2 tobacco investments in the portfolio, but they're the 2 that are really leading the charge globally and taking market share as a result in these alternative reduced risk tobacco products, British American Tobacco and Philip Morris International. So that's an example of a social element of ESG, if you will. Another example I'd give you is on governance, and governance is a real important thing to us. We're looking for companies that are managed in a transparent fashion with independent control and checks and balances to prevent people from going off the rails, staying humble, if you will, to come back to an earlier comment. And one of the areas that we invest in heavily is the auto business. And here I'm going to kind of get into both an environmental and a governance thing. But one of the big companies in the auto business, if you're investing in auto companies, is Volkswagen. And, we're pretty close with all the big German auto manufacturers and have spent time with all those management teams. But many years ago, we had concluded that amongst the 3 big German auto manufacturers, Volkswagen was definitely not one that we could invest in with confidence, just because the lack of transparency there and a lot of governance issues, frankly, without getting into detail around that company. Now, we couldn't have known that, those lack of governance structures, lack of humility enforcing structures, if you will, would result in something as egregious as the diesel scandal at Volkswagen, which cost the company billions of dollars. But certainly our due diligence around issues like governance kept us out of a Volkswagen. Interesting as a sidebar comment, it was really more the environmental issue that got us out of the other auto manufacturers in Germany, because we realized a few years ago that as important as the drive to electric cars was, and as much as a leader in this space the German auto manufacturers were becoming, they were not going to be able to make money doing this through this transition period, which had already begun by 16, 17, and they were really ramping up production, but not really collecting revenues from clients or customers at the same level, right? Because they all want electric, but they're not willing to pay for it. And so what we did instead, in understanding what was going on here, was shift a lot of our investments towards I call them the angels, rather than the sinners. So if the sinners were the big auto companies, the angels were the parts companies that were supplying the new high technology batteries and parts you need to make electric vehicles. And we realized, boy, these guys are going to be making a boatload of money the next several years as they ramp up production, helping the whole world and the environment and the Pope with Laudato Si and everything else, but at the same time making money doing it. And so for several years there, we found ourselves in the parts companies and away from the auto companies. That's starting to change again now, but now that the auto companies are beginning to make that transition, and we may be entering an era of very attractive kind of demand for those kind of products at better pricing. But that's another example of how we would use the engagement process of active investing, sustainable investing, to get our clients in the right place, but also maybe to make the world a little bit better at the same time. A third area I want to talk about, specifically environmental, and a company that you all know is Coca-Cola Company, which obviously is, a stock that's a global leader in its space, so belongs in a lot of portfolios because of its brand and its ability to operate successfully over a long period of time. But Coke has found itself in the middle of quite a big mess here, because almost all of their products, not almost all, but a lot of them are packaged in plastic bottles. And plastic, it turns out, everyone thinks is recyclable. A lot of it's not. And importantly, even when it is recyclable, it's often not recycled, but rather just dumped in the oceans. And, without getting into a big debate about whether that's good or bad, I would just, and forget the science aside, it can't be a good thing in my mind that we're dumping a lot of plastic bottles in the oceans. I mean, that's not taking care of our environment in the way that the Pope is even asking us to do, and that God certainly is not. So we've been engaged in a number of conversations over the last couple of years with Coca-Cola about this topic. They've got someone really working hard on this, and we and other investors have been pushing for them to make more progress in this front. One, because we think it's a good thing, and two, because we think over time their customer base is going to go elsewhere if they don't get with it, because increasingly, particularly younger customers, are less and less interested in buying products in plastic packaging form. So Coke is now in a big transition to get out of plastic. You'll see that develop over the next several years, but they've got a pretty good plan, in our view, to transition out of plastic into more recyclable forms of packaging their product that we think will make them a more sustainable investment over the long haul. So those are three examples. I don't think the way forward here is easy for any of us. But again, I do think as Catholics and as leaders, we need to be engaged here. There are no perfect answers. The world is not that easy, but we have part of the answer. And I think that's Christ and his teachings and our beliefs are very simpatico with the ideas of the dignity of every person, the importance of humility, and the importance of protecting the world and making it better, and not just operating for short-term profits, but for sustainable long-term ones that mean not just dollars and cents, but also mean happy customers and employees that love coming to work every day. So that's what I've got to say about woke capitalism. I hope you all have a wonderful conference, and I'm open for follow-up questions if you'd like to get to them to me through Andrew. So thank you very much, and have a great afternoon.